Okay, well, welcome everyone to Aerial Photo Interpretation Project Planning Workshop. I'm Janet Reyes, the Geospatial Information Librarian here at UC Riverside Library, and happy to share what I can share that will be helpful to you about what you might need to think about if you have a photo interpretation project going on and you need to have it work as smoothly and efficiently as possible. So if that sounds like the kind of information you're looking for, I'm happy to share that with you. But if not, then I won't feel bad if you end up deciding to leave. So a couple of housekeeping things. This workshop is being recorded, and in either a few days to a few weeks, the recording will be available on the library's YouTube channel. Also, if you have registered for this workshop and I have your email address, there will be an email from me where I will share the slides with you. So you want to keep an eye out on your inbox for that. It might be in your junk mail folder or something, but I will share the slides with you. And the slides have a lot of important links, so you'd want to keep an eye out for that. There's a lot of information here. I'm going to try to get through all of it, so I may not have time for answering lots of questions as we go, and I'll try not to get too involved in details as I share my slides, just for the interest of making sure I cover all the information, but you're certainly welcome to reach out to me later if we don't have time today to answer some of your questions. Other workshop housekeeping, I have an assistant today. His name is Fred. He's just keeping an eye on the chat for me in case there's anything that I need to know about. And he'll also be pasting some links into the chat for me as we proceed. So I think that's it. I think that's all I need to say right now. So with that, let's get rolling. We start with the UCR land acknowledgement. We'd like to respectfully acknowledge our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. So here's an outline of what we'll cover today. The first section I'm calling just the value of photo interpretation, or why do people even use it in this day and age. Then once we get past that, we'll talk about project variables and decisions that you make based upon what those project variables are. Some sources of aerial imagery. Most of the time, people will probably be using GIS to do their mapping. So we're going to take a little bit of a look at what's involved with that. When you do some mapping from photo interpretation, you're going to probably want to make sure that you have some other information, some ancillary materials to refer to. So we'll talk about some of that. I have one slide on project workflow, a couple of slides on quality assurance and quality control, and then we'll wrap up. So the value of photo interpretation, or why do we do this? Here are some of the many use cases for photo interpretation. Like, look at all the different types of fields that might be interested in extracting information from aerial photography that has not been mapped before. I imagine that some of these fields might pertain to you, and what I'm going to try to do now is launch a poll, just a 2-question poll, to give me a feel for what your interests are. So here it goes. And I'll give you just a couple seconds to respond to that if you'd like. Okay, I think that's very helpful for me. I'll end the poll now. So thank you all for participating. And what I can see, I don't know if you're going to be able to see these results or not, but most of the time, people hope to have a project in the future, and it's almost all about land use and land cover. So that's fortunate because that's where my background is as well. I see Nate says deforestation is one. That's an excellent topic as well. Yeah, so anyway, thank you all. And that helps me target what I'll talk about or stress as we go forward through the workshop. Okay, so the basic photo interpretation objectives. What you want to do is identify something that's on the ground, visible on the image, then decide what category it belongs in. That could be as simple as this is something I need to map versus so this is not something I need to map. But if it is something you need to map, then you want to capture the feature either as a point, line, or a polygon. A polygon is an area or a shape, and it feels like drawing a line because you actually delineate the boundaries around the polygon, but it has to be, when you finish drawing that line, it closes where you started, so that pinches off an area on your map. And then often a photo interpretation project will involve not only capturing something, but then also extra information about what it is. And we call that the attributes of a feature. So in this example, it's kind of old school from Canada. On the right-hand side, you see that they've identified a plantation forest, a natural forest, and an open field. And maybe some of those extra attributes say about the natural forest, well, is it deciduous or coniferous? Is it mixed? Is it low in stature? What's the crown cover like? All that kind of stuff. So those are an example of the type of attributes you might capture in addition to it's just a thing I need to map, if that makes sense. And what do we call the process? I just have this slide in here mainly to show you that there's lots of different names for this. And I don't think that there's any one official or preferred name for it. I've heard almost all of these used. And what it is not is photogrammetry. Photogrammetry refers to measurements and maybe doing mosaicing and things like that, or image classification or image processing, which I have a couple slides coming up on that. So a lot of times people say we don't need photo interpreters anymore because machines can do the interpretation for us. And that is true up to a large extent. I just wanted to talk to you briefly about the two basic kinds of ways in which computers can do some of this work. The more modern one is on the left-hand side of your screen, the deep learning. The idea is you feed a computer like 10,000 or 100,000 images of, say, cars, and then you ask it to identify cars on photos that you feed into it after that, and it's able to recognize those. And this does work a lot pretty well for things like cars, or you see solar panels there, roads, something that's got a pretty consistent, what we call photo signature over a variety of conditions. An earlier version of computers helping interpret imagery is what's called image classification. It's still used today, I believe. And if you think about a digital image composed of pixels, and each little pixel element in that image has a reflectance, say, a color value, whatever, and they could train the computer to recognize if it's this range of reflectance, then it must be forest, or it must be urban area, or it must be water. And then with that information, they can feed it another digital image, and the computer can classify the categories based on what you have told them they would be. So those two things still happen quite a bit, I have to say. But there are scenarios for using photo interpretation instead of image processing. Obviously, the first bullet point is kind of an obvious one, like, well, whenever it yields a more favorable benefit cost ratio for you. But some of these other bullet points kind of go into that a little bit. So for one reason, maybe the mapper lacks the technology or expertise for image processing. If your task is to map to an adjoining area that has already been mapped, and that was done using photo interpretation, then you want to also use photo interpretation to continue that. If you need higher accuracy, then image processing will get you. And the reason people doing photo interpretation can be more accurate is because we have a brain and we can do nuanced data extraction. For instance, we can apply information that we get from other data sources, apply local knowledge that we've learned. Maybe if we have different sources or additional sources, we can compensate sometime for tree cover or cloud cover in the primary image source. Also, if you think of, well, never mind about image processing, I can just go out in the field and look all around at my whole area, either by walking it or driving through it. Well, photo interpretation is more efficient usually for doing that kind of thing too, because with photo interpretation, you can get to hard to access areas very quickly. So anyway, just a little bit of reasoning of why photo interpretation is a good skill to have. It's still a valuable skill, and there is some cause for it in these days. Okay, I'm going to take a drink of water and I'll pause to see if there's any questions, but otherwise we will go on to project variables and decisions. Okay. Is this mostly on R? I don't know that you can do too much with photo interpretation on R, to be honest. I have thought about that question, and yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a use case for it, but maybe I'm just not thinking about it deeply enough. So anyway, yeah, I think you do need a geographic information system to do this for the most part. So project variables. I think most of you said in the poll that you are thinking of starting a project or you hope you're going to get one. Well, these are the kind of things that might come up that make one project different from the next. First, who are the end users of the data going to be? And then the purpose of why you're creating this map. And as part of that, it's really important, or it helps a great deal, to identify the scope. And that's both what will be mapped and also what won't be mapped. These kind of projects are notable for having scope creep sometimes. So it's like, oh, as long as you're looking for that, why don't you just also, tell us where the blah, blah, blahs are, and then it can get out of hand. So you want to be definite about what you are and aren't going to do. The geographic extent is important, of course, both how large the area is that you're going to be mapping, and then also where that is and how accessible it is and things like that. Resources, of course, are always a factor. What you can do when you have 50 people and lots of high-powered computers is much different from what you can do when you have 2 or 3 people and just a laptop or 2. Time, of course, is important. And the deliverables, like what is going to be the final product? Is it going to be just maps? Are you going to provide some data too? Usually a final report is involved, and any other kind of documentation that the person funding the project might want to have. So then with all of those variables, then you have the project. Now you have to start thinking about what I'm going to do with this project. The first one is what GIS platform I'm going to use. And I have some slides following that are going to cover some of these areas in a little bit more detail. How am I going to manage the data? What scale range should we use for mapping? Should we be zoomed way far out, or should we be zoomed way far in, or something in between? What's going to be my primary image source? What other data sources can I use that will help me make my interpretations more accurate? What am I going to use for a mapping methodology? And what criteria are we going to establish for what's going to be mapped and how it's going to be mapped? Is there, if the field work is a thing, then how much field work are you going to do, and how is that going to be spread throughout the project? And then what degree of precision and accuracy are we going to aim for? And that can go in a few different ways. For instance, if you've got what a feature is called, you can be very general and say it's institutional, or you can be more specific and say it's a middle school. And then we also can define, before we get started, what's the smallest polygon size going to be that we say we are going to map? Or what's the shortest line segment we are going to map? If you say you're doing hydrology or something like that, you're like, how short are you going to go before you just ignore it? And then Also, how much detail and precision are you going to put in the delineation itself, and how important are those things? I'm going to keep, I saw that there was a question in the chat. I'm going to keep going maybe at least through the section and then before I read that question. So if you can bear with me there. So choosing a GIS platform, like I said, I imagine almost everybody's going to use GIS in a photo interpretation project these days. And these are what I call the big three. Esri is the industry leader, and they have products that are usually start with the word or the phrase ArcGIS. So their current desktop version is ArcGIS Pro. ArcGIS Online would not be a good candidate for actually capturing things off of a photo. They can only, at this point, it only allows for dropping points and a few lines. It's not really great for if you have to do hundreds or thousands of delineations. I would just stick with the desktop version there. But it has related apps that you might be interested in as well. QGIS is a free and open source alternative to Esri products, and they can do almost everything that Esri products can do. And then Google Earth Pro, I don't know if you've ever explored that, but it's available with 2D or 3D views, and it comes with multiple years of base map imagery in there. And there are other GIS platforms, but these are the three that would come to mind first, I guess, if you're going to look around. And then I have at the bottom of the slide there, if you are going to do field data collection, there are some apps that will help you with that. If you're capturing data with drones or UAVs, there are some apps that will help you along with that as well. I mentioned data management plan, and it's always good to have a plan, right? Sometimes if you're working on a grant-funded project, depending on who the funder is, they might insist that you have an official data management plan. And I've got a couple of links on the slide that lead you to more information about that. But basically what you want to cover is, how am I going to store and back up the data? What kind of folder naming and file naming, and how am I going to structure that hierarchy? How am I going to take care of different versions of the data? And the last term there is metadata. And on the next slide, I believe I talk about what that is in case you're not familiar with it. It's information about the map or the resource that you are creating. And as you can see, it covers the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And with mapping, there's a few additional things as well. And it's to provide somebody who is searching for data and they're not sure, is this the data set that's going to help me with what I need to do? They can read through what the metadata is, and they can understand whether this will or will not or might work for them before they even get around to like downloading the data to look at it themselves. So metadata is, not too many people are fond of creating metadata, but it really is important if you want to have your geospatial data out there to share. So you do want to think about creating metadata. And if you're mapping, again, sometimes the mapping is just like, do I see a cell phone tower? Do I not? And that's the end of it. But in a lot of cases, and some of you mentioned you're doing land use land cover. So this example on the right-hand side is the classification for land use and land cover for using with remote sensor data. This is one that I've been familiar with throughout my career, often using it in land use mapping projects. And it's a hierarchy. And if your data lends itself to being thought of in a hierarchy, it's great to structure your classification that way as well. So more detailed information can be nested up to a higher level very easily if you need to. If you're going to create a classification, it's a little easier to deal with numeric strings as far as what you put in the computer for your attribute. Although it takes some memorization or like a lot of referring back to what that numeric string will be for this particular thing, it does make it easier to work with in the long run than just using like the names of stuff. And then you always want to account for blends because they happen in real life. Very, very common for things not to be purely one thing or purely another. And there's different ways you can go about accounting for blends, like commercial have a category that's commercial/residential. So some of each, and it's a pretty even balance for that, but they're mixed together so tightly, you can't really tease them apart. And you see that in the land use and land cover classification. Some of these level 2 categories, they have mixed urban or built up land or other urban or built up land. Here's other agricultural land, mixed farmland. So they've put in a lot of wiggle room baked into this classification because it just happens so often that you need to have a category, a catch-all category for those not clear-cut things. So anyway, going back to a couple other ways that you can account for blends, that you might have a modifier in like an extra digit that might indicate there's something extra going on with that particular delineation, or you might think of it in terms of having a separate layer. So maybe you're mapping vegetation in one layer, but you might have a separate layer that could be overlaid with your vegetation layer that will show where the burned areas are, which is often like very informational or good information for your client to have or your end user to have. Okay, so let me take a look at what was in the chat there. Can photo interpretation be employed as ground truth? I'll have to talk to you a little bit more about that, Jorge. That sounds like a very deep question that I'm not able to grasp fully right now. So let's get back to that one, if you don't mind. Okay, thank you. So let's talk now about sources of aerial imagery. So you might have 3 different categories of imagery you're going to be looking for when you set up your project. You might have imagery to map from. Well, you definitely need that. That's going to be the main source of the information you're mapping. You might need a different set of imagery to map on if that's going to be the base map that you've got, putting your delineations on, registered to that. And then you also might need imagery to refer to support your interpretations. So this could be from different seasons or years, a different image type, like color infrared versus you're using natural color for your main interpretations, that kind of thing. Certainly seasonality is important if you're doing things like mapping deciduous trees. Sometimes one season is the best season to figure out if this is that particular type of tree or not, because it looks very different in one season and not so much in the others. So anyway, those are things you can think about as well when you're searching for imagery sources. And then there's all these different parameters to take a look at as you're hunting for aerial imagery. Of course, you want to know if it covers the area that you have to map. That's super important. Vertical is what you want mostly if this is a possible source that you're going to map from. But sometimes having the oblique or bird's eye view, kind of looking at the ground off to an angle, that can be helpful as a secondary source. The different types of imagery, like I said, there's black and white, also known as panchromatic. There's color infrared. That last one is good for showing vegetation types very distinctively. You want to think about the scale or resolution of the imagery and if it's sharp enough to show you what you need to figure out. The original format may have been a print or a transparency. And then if it's something like that, it was probably scanned to get it into digital format. But then there's other imagery that's born digital and was never anything else. And then what platform was it acquired from? Whether it's fixed wing aircraft or a drone or satellite. And then whether it's orthorectified, which means like it's like using a map. It's all orientate or correctly as far as creating a map. And then cloud cover is a big one. A lot of times you can find a great image source and it's just what you need and it covers just what you want, but oh, look, it's like 60% cloud cover. So you have to kind of keep on your toes for that one. And I've just got a couple slides here that help with where you can go looking for historical imagery. So I'm thinking mostly of older satellite imagery and then also photography that was captured from a fixed wing aircraft. Government agencies are great. I've just listed like a US federal government and California government, but certainly other parts of the world that they have some repositories as well that you could take a look at. If you're looking at a local area, sometimes flood control districts are a surprising source of good quality aerial photography. Don't forget libraries. A lot of academic libraries have an aerial photo collection. Some public libraries do as well. And then I just wanted to highlight, like our library has a few atlases that are real estate atlases. I think they were popular like in the 90s and early 2000s. They're just really big books, but they have pretty detailed aerial photography to help the realtors understand where a particular property was, but they could have other uses as well. It's great. So you might want to think about that as a possible source, as a secondary source for you. And then there's other places you can look, like museums and historical societies. There's an enterprise on the web called Historical Aerials that for a fee will provide you with some scans of historical imagery that they have. So many choices there. For more recent imagery, the top two links on this slide are just a compendium of places that other folks have pulled together for where you can go looking for imagery, for more recent imagery. Again, the government agencies have some. And then there are some vendors like Planet Labs. We just had a visit from folks from Planet a few weeks ago here at UCR. They have satellites that circle the globe, and they provide daily coverage of the planet, which is pretty awesome. And here at UCR, we have an agreement for the next few years to download many of their images for free, so that's helpful. And then GIS platforms do have imagery associated with them, like Google Earth and Esri products. I have a red asterisk there, and that's because there's a caveat that I'm going to talk about a couple slides from now regarding imagery that you'll find in the GIS. Okay, doing pretty well for time. I'll take another quick sip of water, and if anybody else wanted to pose any questions, this would be a good time to do that. Otherwise, we'll move on. I'm reading Nate's question. Not quite, Nate. I understand it's really complicated when you're first getting going. Really what we use the GIS for is to make the delineations as you manually code the land cover. It's using one of those, what do you call it, like deep learning modules or something, if that applies to what you're doing, might be a way to get the rest of the GIS to code the rest of it for you. Yeah, deep learning is a whole other thing. So yes, indeed. Yeah, but we can certainly chat more afterwards about what your particular needs are. Yeah. So let's see, GIS to view and map. So again, like if you're going to use imagery in a GIS, there could be individual images, like maybe your study area is really small. It's just a small historical area that you want to take a look at what it looked like in the 1930s or 40s or something like that. And in that case, you would need to have scans of the original images and georeference them. And my next slide talks about what that is. Imagery is base map. And so I want to caution you about this. It can be great when you pull up Google Earth or you pull up an Esri product and you've got an option for imagery and it looks great. And you go like, oh, I can just interpret from this. I need to let you know, though, that the base map imagery can change over time, over location and zoom level. So for instance, the other day, I was in Google Earth Pro And I've just picked an area and I zoomed in and out, and I was looking at the information regarding the imagery at the bottom of my screen. And there was about 4 different image sets covering the same area just based on how much I was zoomed in or out. So that can happen, and it can catch you unawares if you don't know that that can happen. Same thing with location. Like I might be looking at Lancaster, California, and I pan up to Boron or something, and different image source, even though I haven't changed my zoom level. And then time too, if you come back to the same area like 6 months later in the same platform, they're going to have maybe an updated image source that wasn't the same one that you were looking at back when you first started 6 months ago. So all of that can happen, and it's really tricky to figure out the information about the imagery you're looking at as a base map right then and there. I did include a link from Esri about how you can figure out some of the metadata about the base map imagery for a particular area, but it's kind of convoluted, and it's not really what I would recommend as using a base map as your primary source of interpretation. But it's great to map against, if that makes any sense. And then image mosaics. I don't know if any of you are going to be involved in projects where images are being collected from a drone. That's a common use case these days for wanting to mosaic a bunch of individual images together, but sometimes we want to do that with historical images as well. So I just have a couple links there that may help you if you need to do some mosaicing as part of your project, or you think you might need to just stitch a bunch of photos together and have a seamless, bigger image as a result from all of that. So georeferencing. What this does is if you have an image that you're loading into a GIS, it's not going to know initially where to put that image. It's just going to float out in space somewhere until you do this process called georeferencing, which is you would want to find readily identifiable features. Road intersections are great, for instance, and you find them both on your base map, whether that's a map or an image, and you find the same thing on the image that you're loading in. You find several of these sets of points, and then push a button and it'll bring in the scanned image to coincide as pretty closely with the base map that you're using. So that's a process that you may have to do. And the TIFF format is a common format for images that are used in a GIS. And I wanted to mention that if you ever have a choice in what kind of image to acquire, and it says TIFF, and then it says there's also available in GeoTIFF, well, you want to get the GeoTIFF one because that image has already been georeferenced, and you won't have to go through this process if you have something that's a GeoTIFF. So something to keep in mind there. And imagery is base map. These are examples from ArcGIS Pro. There's 3 different choices, maybe more, as ready-to-load base maps. They talk about just imagery, then they have imagery hybrid. And what these hybrids are is it's the image, but it also has some annotation on it, like street names, city names, maybe some outstanding places, marked, annotated on the base map. So it's kind of a combo of having a map and an image. So those are choices you might have there. More broadly, in the whole ArcGIS world of apps, there's something called Living Atlas of the World. And this provides hundreds of choices of images that are already available digitally. You can see some of the subcategories there are base map, multispectral, temporal, which means like for a certain time period, and then event imagery, like it might be before and after a natural disaster kind of thing. So if you were going to use Esri products and you know you're going to need imagery, you might want to take a good look at what's available in Living Atlas, because that might be just the thing you need, and it's certainly easy to use if you are going to be using Esri products. And they update it all the time too. It's an ongoing thing, so something to think about there. Then I have this slide about Google Earth Pro because imagery is the base map. They don't have like a map as a base map in Google Earth Pro. And it can be a really great tool for folks to use. I have a screenshot of what the toolbar looks like on the top, where there's a button you can push if you wanted to add an image overlay. The big one that's often really helpful in the projects I've been on is this one with the backwards arrow around the clock, that's how you get to see the historical imagery that Google Earth Pro has stored up. And then this is just kind of a fun thing. It might apply in your researcher mapping if you wanted to see the sunlight at different angles. But the historical imagery is really a big deal. And on this slide, what I have here, for those of you who are familiar with the Riverside area, I took a screenshot of the most recent imagery that I saw at the time this is the Moreno Valley area, which is just southeast of campus. And this is what the same area looked like in 1985. So as you can see, quite a lot of development between the 2 years. And also look at the difference in the quality of the imagery. Like this one's really fuzzy compared to this, right? So that's technological improvements over time and all that good stuff. So yeah, it's something to watch out for as you're trying to select imagery. The quality isn't necessarily always going to be as crisp and sharp as what you see has been collected in recent years. And I have this slide that just has a whole bunch of links to help you get started on how to add imagery to a GIS and some of the manipulations you might want to do with that. Okay, let's talk next about ancillary materials. Like I said, in addition to having your primary image source, it's really going to help your interpretations. As much information as you can gather that will be relevant to what you're mapping will be awesome. So this could be maps, and it could be topographic maps. An example of a topographic map is over here on top on the right-hand side, where it shows you the elevation. It has some detail of roads and buildings and things like that. Gives you some idea of what are cleared areas and what are vegetated and that kind of thing. Road maps can help, or thematic maps, like maybe somebody has a geology map or a vegetation map or something like that, might help you with what you're looking for. These maps could be different scales, not necessarily the scale you're mapping at. Could be different geographic extents. But whatever might help you, you want to take some time at the start of your project to look around and see what you can come up with. And again, they may be sheet maps like individual maps, or they could be bound in an atlas. They could be in publications, like somebody did a report and they have some maps in the report that might help you, or information that's available online. And then for imagery, secondary imagery, again, like you could try to see what you can come up with for historical imagery, if that would be of help, satellite images in ground photos or oblique photos. So I have here like Google Maps and Google Earth and Bing Maps are three of the potential secondary image sources you might want to think about if they're not your primaries. All three of these applications or platforms, all of them provide oblique views and also street views. Excellent if you're going to do land use land cover interpretations. Street view can be a real godsend, and so can oblique at times. And then also these two, Google Maps and Google Earth, they also provide crowdsourced ground photos. There's a thing you can toggle on for both of those if you want to see ground photos of an area. So this here at lower right is an image of our campus that I found as a crowdsourced ground photo that I think it was on Google Maps. And that's great too, because this is a view you wouldn't see from a street view because this is interior to the campus. And if you needed to know what kind of vegetation this was, for instance, well, here's a great way to take a close look at it. So again, things to keep in mind if you weren't aware of before. These could be really good sources for you. And then documents and local knowledge too. So again, like reports that were done maybe for a different purpose, but they might have contain some information that's helpful to you. Books and journal articles, websites, And then people as well can be a good source. Local experts, like maybe there's somebody who works for the local government who is out in the field a lot and might know about some of the things that you're interested in. Academics who are doing research about things might have some helpful information for you. And even friendly citizens, this has happened a time or two, like just people know they've lived there forever and they know the history of what was going on in this part of town or whatever. So yeah, just be open to all those possibilities as you're trying to get supporting information for what you're looking at. Let's talk about project workflow next. And I'm trying to keep this really broad because, again, for folks who may be watching this recording later, your topics may be very different from just land use, land cover, or vegetation. So it would be possible to get into much more depth for any individual type of mapping, but I'm just trying to keep it broad enough for now to serve the most number of people who might stumble across this workshop. So, but for project workflow, there's a lot you can say here. I'm just picking out some of the highlights or the really important parts. You're probably going to want to create a mapping methodology document, which would remind yourself and anybody else who's helping on the project what to do step by step as they proceed with interpreting the photo. What are they going to pull up on their screen? What tool are they going to use? All of that kind of stuff. And expect that to be a living document. It's very rare project that you understand perfectly exactly what to do and what should be done throughout the course of the project. It's going to be updated most likely. So just don't necessarily keep it set in stone if a better way comes up as you proceed through the project. You'd also want to create a document for criteria or decision rules, or how do we decide if this is a this versus a that, that kind of a thing. This could be a separate document, or maybe you would want to append it to your classification outline, whichever way works best for you, depending on how complicated it is. But sometimes your decision rules can get pretty lengthy and pretty like if this, then that, but then another if this and this, then it would be this, and then, or maybe that, so it can get really complicated and a lot to read through. So maybe you want to create a cheat sheet for yourself and for others, just a boiled down version of some of those criteria decision rules for people to refer to on the fly as they're going along. And then as decisions are made, again, these decision rules, they can be updated through the course of the project. Very likely that they will be, because you encounter things that you didn't expect at the start of the project. And like, oh, now what do we do with this? So you want to establish a means to log and communicate updates to the rules that you established at the start. That's really important because it's very easy for people to maybe not be aware of the updates or kind of forget, or they heard part of it, but not the whole thing. So you really want to have a way to keep everybody on the project informed about what the latest and greatest is. Another tip on project workflow is, will there be handoffs or kind of like an assembly line sort of thing? Or is your vision that everyone performs all the tasks from start to finish on the particular area they're assigned to? Handoffs could be valuable if, say, for instance, maybe you have an undergraduate on your team and their skill set isn't quite as developed as some of the other folks on the team. But is there like a simpler task that you could maybe let them handle, and that cuts down on the amount of time that all the people who have more of a skill set to do the more difficult or nuanced work, that would cut down on their time that they have to spend on setting it up or whatever. So that's something to think about too, like who do you have available to you and what's the best use of their time to make the whole thing flow better. And then, yeah, you probably want to establish a means to track the progress as you go through the project. This gets into project management kind of things, but it's usually good to have some feel for, are we way behind? Are we right on schedule? Are we way ahead? Do we need to ask for more money, more time, or whatever it is? That happens quite a bit. So yeah, just have a way to track that would be great. Okay, coming up, again, I don't want to pause too much, but quality assurance and quality control is a really important things. So I want to just make sure that we cover all of these points, and then we're getting close to the end of the workshop. So what can go wrong, or what can be an error, or at least an inconsistency? There's lots of possibilities here. And let's start with what we're calling the things, what attributes have been assigned to a particular feature that you have mapped. Well, sometimes people can just forget to assign an attribute to a feature. So there's some missing attributes. There can be invalid attributes, like that's not even a possibility of, what this thing could be. That's just not even in the set of possibilities. The next one is maybe not so much an error, but just a difference of style, but you want to make it more consistent. So having inconsistent interpretation. And one of the classic examples of this is lumpers versus splitters. So remember I said, like, there's sometimes in a classification, there are those mixed categories. So a lumper would be inclined to just lean on, oh, there's a mixed category and this is really complicated and complex, so I'm just going to call it the mixed, versus somebody who's more on a meticulous side of things, and they're like, I can split this out. I can get 2 different polygons out of this if I draw my line carefully enough. So, I mean, neither one is wrong, but maybe overall the course of the whole map, you would almost be able to tell which person interpreted which area because of the differences between lumpers and splitters. And then hopefully before you deliver the product, you want to get that sorted out and taken care of. Or incorrect attributes, right? Like sometimes we just type in the wrong thing, or sometimes people might misremember what the rules are and they think they're typing in the right thing, but oh no, that's not the way it was really. And then there's also errors with how things are mapped. So one phrase you may or may not be familiar with is topology. That's just how all the physical map elements fit together. Like, are there gaps where there shouldn't be gaps? Are there overlaps where there shouldn't be overlaps? Do we have duplicated features to worry about that were made by accident? That kind of thing. We can have misregistered features, which means that the delineation is not sitting directly on top of the thing that it's supposed to be capturing. Sometimes that happens if you're using a GIS and you're not careful. You can kind of accidentally drag something away from its initial position. So that's one way misregistered features can happen. Sometimes you miss a feature, like somebody just didn't see that on the photo, or it was the end of the day and they just said, that's it, and then they forgot to go back and map that next feature. Sloppy delineations just means kind of they were not paying super careful attention to how they drew that boundary or that line. And then sometimes, again, this is sort of going a parallel to the lumpers versus splitters. Some people like to put lots and lots of detail in everything they draw, and some people are very general and kind of smooth it out too much. And so you want to have those things maybe reconciled at some point in the project. So my next slide shows you an example of differences in detail of delineations. On the left, you can see somebody put in a fair amount of effort to capture the feature as closely as they could. I would critique them a little bit, like this pointy edge would probably not be something that you would want to see on a map of a stream. So you might want to have that rounded off a little bit more. Some other pointy edges as well. And look, this intersection looks pretty complicated, versus this person just kind of blew past that whole complicated intersection and just made it sort of meet up sort of in the middle, averaging out everything. And that might not be bad if the ultimate map is going to be zoomed way out. This will be a much cleaner look than if this is the way it was drawn and it's zoomed way out. This is going to look like a big kind of blob if you're zoomed way out. And so, it depends on what the scale is, but that's just to give you an example of how this is the kind of thing you might need to reconcile if one person's drawing more like this and one person's drawing more like what's on the right-hand side. So what can we do to kind of get these sort of things resolved? Well, for attribute data quality, what you can do is establish valid values or what's called attribute domains when that's possible. So maybe, you have just 7 categories and the codes or the attributes would be the numbers 1 through 7. Then you see somebody has typed a 9. The computer would flag that as like, that's not possible, better fix this, that kind of a thing. You can also get a little trickier and establish consistency rules. So if you picture what's called the attribute table that sits in back of the map, maybe one column in this table, which is just like a spreadsheet, really, maybe one column is for land cover and another column is for slope. So if the land cover column has a feature that's identified as a lake, you would want the slope to be pretty much 0%. You do not want a lake that has a 10 to 15% slope, right? So that would be that's an example of that kind of a consistency check that you could set up with the help of the GIS or with just data management kind of things. To catch oddball attributes as they have been mapped, what you can do also is run what we call a frequency check at the end of mapping. So maybe like you have the possibility of 25 different attributes for this one column of type of information. And you've mapped thousands of features, and there's one feature that has this one attribute and none of the other ones do. You might want to just take a look at that and verify that that's really what it's supposed to be. Another way you can check is to change the symbology on the map. So maybe different colors assigned to different attributes and then compare to what your expectations are. So let's talk about land cover. If you have, say, urban industrial as a category, you wouldn't expect to see that on the side slope of a mountain in Yosemite National Park, right? So that kind of a thing. You can do it as a visual check just to make sure that things are making sense. So in ArcGIS Pro, there is a tool that's called Data Reviewer, where you can set up some of these kinds of checks, and it'll help you find them and fix the errors. So it's not just depending on you to scan through all the maps and find all the errors. It's a big help if you can get that going. Now, cartographic data quality, one way to avoid some of the problems that can arise is if you make sure snapping is on during mapping. So if you have line segments that you're drawing at different times and they are supposed to connect perfectly, not undershoot, not overshoot, but just meet directly, you'd be surprised how difficult that is if you don't have snapping on, because it may look fine at the scale you're mapping at, but if you zoomed in to say 1 to 12, a really, really large scale, you might see that there's a little bit of a gap or a little bit of an overshoot between the two lines. So snapping will help you avoid that kind of error. This third example in this third column here is when there's a river as the blue line, and then a different data source has the county also using the river as the boundary, but they've delineated it slightly differently. So there's a little bit of a gap here, a little bit of a push the county past the river there. So again, snapping can be set up, and I'll rectify it to in this case, the river, and it matches perfectly. So yeah, there's topology checks that you can run afterwards, and it will catch these kind of problems. Yeah, both with lines and with polygons. And then edge matching. If your project is going to involve like different subsets of the area being mapped, it's going to be important to take a look at what happens as you bring two different sub-areas together. Even if you're the same person doing both sides, like you're mapping sheet A and then you're mapping sheet B, and that's like 3 months later, and then you come at them from different angles, you may not decide to map them, or you may not even be thinking, oh, I'm mapping this differently from last time. So you would want to take a look at how it looks across the edge, because in the end, this is all going to be merged together into one seamless map, and you don't want to have like little jaggedy things just because there was a map sheet boundary there, right? So this would apply if it's just an individual mapping to themselves, or also one mapper edge matching to somebody else next to him or her. And then sometimes you have to map to previous projects or match the previous projects. And sometimes it's like, oh, I wouldn't map it that way at all. And how am I supposed to match to this because it's wrong? Well, one little trick you can use is just to kind of feather it in, like try to bring that maybe bad delineation or bad attribute into your map a little bit and then round it off. So at least it's not going to be a harsh straight line if that doesn't make sense for the way that the image looks in the background. Just a little trick. It's not perfect, but it's sometimes the best you can do. And then field visits. Again, decide if you have a budget and time for field visits, that might be very helpful to you. Typically, we think of two different types of field visits. A reconnaissance visit might be after you've acquired the imagery and had a chance to look at it a little bit, but before mapping has really gotten geared up. And what you're going to want to do is try to find easy to access sites, maybe just right along the sides of roads or not too far to walk from the road. Some common photo signatures that you're seeing. Make sure the sites are scattered throughout your area of interest. That'll just help you gain more confidence in what you're going to be mapping once you're back to looking at the images on the screen. And when you're doing reconnaissance, again, we could talk an hour just about field visits and things, but you want to have a decision about how you're going to document what you see in the field and how best that's going to be relayed back to the folks who are back in front of a computer and trying to understand what they need to know about this particular type of photo signature. Then field verification would happen as the mapping is maybe at that or past the halfway mark. And this is where there's things that you just couldn't figure out or you're not really sure that you have figured out. You would take the maps that have been created and somehow those areas have been flagged for follow-up, and then you can go visit those and try to resolve as many of those ambiguous situations as you can. Okay, wrapping up. I just want to acknowledge that Lynn Sweet and Luis Barrios from UCR Center for Conservation Biology saw a sneak peek of this presentation a week ago and provided me some very helpful input. And so I appreciate that. And I've incorporated most of what they said into this presentation. And then also many of the procedures and tips in this workshop were developed or refined by Aerial Information Systems, a company in Redlands that I worked for before I became a librarian. So they are the source for a lot of great techniques so I just wanted to give them a shout out for all their hard work over the years and in these kind of projects. So with that, I think you may have seen a link in the chat for oh, okay. Well, pretty soon you will see a link for a survey that you can take. And I know I'm burned out on taking surveys for like stores and things that I visit, but honestly, in this case, the survey will help me understand whether this information was helpful at all, what you would like to see in the future. The survey, it's like there's 3 questions and you just get to pick one of them, whichever one you feel most like answering, and just answer that one and that's it. So again, I appreciate you doing that. I know it's kind of a pain, but yeah. And with that, there's my contact information if you want to reach out to me with any follow-up questions. We've got a few minutes before the hour's up, I think. If anybody would like to unmute and ask me something. But I appreciate your attention today. I hope at least part of this was helpful for you. And yeah, good luck with your mapping. Good luck with staying dry as we're done with the end of this storm that's coming through. And yeah, thank you so much.